The world had already fallen apart long before the first wave of zombies began to roam the streets. It wasn't a sudden event, there were no dramatic explosions or world-shattering announcements. It was the slow decay of society that paved the way for the undead. Governments collapsed, cities fell, and humanity became more of a memory than a presence. And then, the zombies came. But these weren't the usual mindless creatures that shuffled and moaned. These were faster, smarter, and, more terrifyingly, adaptive. At first, the survivors fought back, hoping to push the oncoming darkness away. But nothing could prepare them for the inevitable reality: the world had changed. And now, it wasn't just humanity fighting for survival, it was the very zombies themselves. In a small, decimated town near what was once a thriving metropolis, a lone survivor named Iris stood in the doorway of an abandoned supermarket, her eyes scanning the horizon. She'd survived by staying in the shadows, avoiding both the undead and the desperate humans who now roamed the streets. Iris had seen what the world had become. She had seen how the zombie hordes grew stronger with every passing day, and she had witnessed how the once dominant creatures were now beginning to fall one by one. A strange phenomenon was unfolding. Despite their seemingly invincible nature, the zombies were slowly weakening. Their bodies began to decompose faster, their strength faltered, and the very essence of their relentless hunger seemed to fade. Iris had watched from afar as entire packs of zombies dropped to the ground, lifeless, their skin rotting away before her eyes. It was as if the apocalypse had come full circle, and now even the undead could not escape its reach. The first time she noticed it, she had been hiding in an abandoned church, hoping to rest after a long journey. From the high windows, she had seen them, a group of zombies wandering aimlessly through the streets, but something was wrong. They moved sluggishly, their heads lolling at odd angles, and some had even begun to collapse, their legs giving out beneath them. It was the beginning of something she couldn't explain. It wasn't just the zombies that were affected. The environment itself seemed to be dying. Plants withered, the air grew thick with decay, and even the sky above had turned a dull gray, as if the very atmosphere was succumbing to the infection. The world was in its final stages, but no one knew exactly what was causing the zombies to fail. It was as if the earth itself was rejecting them, as though they were never meant to walk its surface. Iris had seen enough in her time as a survivor to know that nothing made sense anymore. Yet, as days passed and the strange phenomenon continued, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that she wasn't the only one who noticed the change. She'd heard rumors from other survivors about strange occurrences, zombies attacking one another, bodies falling to pieces for no apparent reason, and entire hordes simply vanishing without a trace. The world had gone silent, and that silence was more unsettling than the roars of the undead. As she ventured deeper into the town, Iris passed through what remained of the streets, now eerily deserted. The sounds of shuffling footsteps had long been replaced by the eerie quiet of a world that had accepted its fate. There were no more loud clashes between the living and the undead. No more screams of terror or gunshots. Just the slow, steady decline of everything. But as Iris turned a corner near the old train station, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A group of zombies, once the terror of the town, lay motionless in the middle of the road. Their bodies were slumped over, some missing limbs, others with their faces completely rotted away. They hadn't just died. They had disintegrated. Their bodies were falling apart from the inside out, their decayed forms turning to dust before her eyes. It wasn't a natural death. No, this was something far more sinister. Something that Iris couldn't begin to comprehend. Her mind raced with questions. What had happened to them? Why were they dying like this? And more importantly, what did it mean for the future of the human race? As she crouched behind a dilapidated car, watching the crumbling remains of the zombies, she heard a soft crunch behind her. The unmistakable sound of a footstep. Someone, or something, was watching her. Iris's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't alone. Turning quickly, she reached for her weapon, a crowbar she had scavenged days before, but stopped when she saw who it was. A man, covered in grime and dirt, stepped into the dim light. He looked just as worn down as she felt. His clothes were torn, and his face was gaunt, but there was something in his eyes. Something that told her he had seen the same horrors she had. He spoke, his voice hoarse from lack of use. "You've seen it too, haven't you?" Iris didn't answer immediately. She simply nodded, her eyes narrowing as she scanned his face for any sign of threat. There were no guarantees in this world, and trust was a luxury no one could afford anymore. The man stepped closer, his movements slow but deliberate. "They're all falling apart," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The zombies, they're dying. And I don't think it's by accident." Iris studied him for a moment before speaking. "What do you think it means?" He paused, his eyes distant. "I don't know. But whatever it is, it's not just the end of the zombies. It might be the end of everything." And with those words, Iris realized that the apocalypse was far from over, it had only just begun. The world was on the brink of a new disaster, and this time, even the dead were falling apart. As the wind began to pick up, a storm rolling in from the distance, Iris felt a chill run down her spine. The worst was yet to come. The days were beginning to blur together. Time no longer held any significance in a world that had already shattered. Iris, now joined by the mysterious man who had introduced himself as Callum, spent their nights in an old underground bunker, carefully guarded against the undead and any other threats that might lurk in the decaying world above. Callum had become an unlikely companion, someone who seemed to understand the subtle shifts in the air, the small signs that suggested the end of civilization wasn't merely an act of nature, it was being orchestrated by something else. Iris was skeptical at first, but the more they witnessed the changes in the zombies, the more she realized there was truth in his words. It wasn't just the zombies falling apart, they were becoming something worse, something almost incomprehensible. The first time they encountered a group of these changed zombies, Iris thought she was seeing things. They had stumbled upon a dilapidated gas station, its windows shattered and its roof half collapsed. The sign above it, which once proudly displayed the name Simmons Fuel, now flickered faintly in the wind. Callum had insisted on exploring it. "We need supplies," he had said, his voice low. "And we need to figure out what's going on." They moved cautiously through the wreckage, the air thick with decay. It wasn't long before they heard the faint shuffle of feet. But when they rounded the corner, what they saw made their hearts stop. A group of zombies was gathered around the remains of a burned-out car. But unlike the mindless drones they had grown accustomed to, these creatures were moving differently, erratically, almost as though they were confused by something. Some of them would stagger forward only to collapse, their limbs twitching uncontrollably. Others just stood still, frozen in place, their heads tilted at odd angles. The air smelled sour, an overpowering stench of rot that even Iris had to force herself not to gag at. But what truly struck her was the sound. It wasn't the usual low moan or guttural growl. Instead, it was like a whisper, a low, strained, almost pleading sound that seemed to emanate from their throats. Callum moved closer, his eyes wide with both fear and curiosity. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, though Iris already knew the answer. It wasn't just the physical collapse of the zombies that was happening, it was something inside them, something deep and unsettling. Their hunger, their need for flesh, seemed to be shifting, fading. Their very essence was unraveling. Before they could retreat back to the relative safety of their shelter, one of the zombies, a tall, lanky creature with a grotesque, misshapen face, turned toward them. Its eyes were glazed over, but there was something distinctly human about them, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps desperation. The creature took a few staggered steps in their direction before suddenly collapsing to the ground, its body convulsing violently. A horrible, gurgling sound emerged from its throat before it simply fell still, a heap of flesh and bone, barely recognizable as a human form. Iris took a step back, her pulse quickening. "What the hell was that?" she muttered under her breath. Callum's expression had turned grim. "That wasn't just a regular zombie. Something's changing. And I think it's happening to all of them." Iris didn't want to believe it, but as they moved deeper into the station, they found more of the same. Bodies collapsing, their limbs breaking apart, their skin rotting at a terrifying rate. It wasn't a gradual process, it was a violent breakdown, as if the very virus that had turned them into monsters was suddenly attacking itself. By the time they left the station, Iris's mind was swirling with more questions than answers. Why was this happening? What was causing it? And most importantly, could anyone survive a world where even the undead couldn't? The answer came sooner than they expected. As they made their way back to the bunker, they passed by what had once been a residential neighborhood. The houses were crumbling, their windows shattered by the violent forces of the apocalypse. But as they walked down the empty street, Iris froze. In the distance, she could see something moving, something large, something different. It was a massive horde of zombies, but this time, there was no mindless shuffling. The creatures moved with purpose, not in a single line, but in an erratic, almost choreographed pattern, as though they were drawn to something. Something was pulling them together. Iris and Callum ducked behind the wreckage of a broken-down car, watching from a distance as the horde began to gather in the center of the street. They had no idea what was happening, but it was clear, this wasn't a normal zombie gathering. As the minutes passed, the horde seemed to grow more frenzied, more desperate. The ground shook beneath their feet as if a storm was brewing, not in the sky, but in the very heart of the undead. Suddenly, without warning, the horde surged forward. It was an unstoppable wave, a force of nature in its own right, but Iris could see that they weren't just attacking random survivors, they were moving towards something specific. "We have to get out of here," Callum hissed, his eyes wide with fear. But Iris couldn't move. Her gaze was fixed on the center of the chaos. A figure, barely visible through the thickening swarm of zombies, stood in the middle of the street, its face hidden in shadow. Whoever, or whatever, was controlling the horde was far more dangerous than anything Iris could have imagined. As the zombies closed in, their movements more synchronized than ever, the figure in the center of it all raised its head, revealing its face. It was no longer a question of survival for the living. This was a war. And Iris didn't know if she was ready for what was coming next. Iris and Callum took cover behind the wrecked car, the sound of the horde's footfalls growing louder, reverberating through the street like an approaching storm. The air was thick with tension, and Iris's mind raced, desperately searching for an escape plan. The zombies weren't just stumbling aimlessly anymore. They were moving in unison, drawn towards something, or someone. But the question still remained, who was leading them? The figure in the middle of the street was still barely visible, but Iris could feel its presence like a cold, malicious force. The zombies weren't mindless creatures, they were responding to something more than their usual hunger. They had a purpose now. They were being controlled. "I don't like this," Callum muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever's out there, it's not just another survivor. It's something worse." Iris didn't answer. She couldn't. Her gaze remained fixed on the figure in the distance, her instincts telling her that this was the turning point. The world had already been ravaged by the undead, but now there was something darker at play. This wasn't just an apocalypse anymore, it was a nightmare with a new and terrifying face. The horde moved closer, their collective growls rising in volume, their limbs jerking in time with some unseen command. It was as though they were anticipating something. The figure, now more visible as it stepped into a patch of dim light, was tall and cloaked in dark rags. Its head was still bowed, casting a shadow over its features. It seemed to radiate an unnatural power, like a puppet master pulling strings on a vast, mindless army. "What do you think it wants?" Iris asked, her voice tight. "I don't know," Callum replied, his eyes darting around, calculating their next move. "But I don't think it's interested in us right now. We need to figure out what it's doing before we make a move." But Iris was already moving. She couldn't just sit back and wait. This wasn't just another zombie gathering, it was something more organized, more strategic. If the undead were being controlled, there had to be a reason. And whoever, or whatever, was pulling the strings had to be stopped before it was too late. Iris slowly rose to her feet, keeping her body low against the wrecked car for cover. She didn't know what Callum was thinking, but she could sense his hesitation. She didn't have time to explain. The zombies were moving faster now, closing in on the figure in the middle of the street. "I'm going," she whispered, though she knew Callum wouldn't approve. There was no time for debate. Before Callum could protest, Iris sprinted toward the shadows of a nearby alley, her heart hammering in her chest. She had no plan, just a gut feeling that she had to get closer, had to understand what was controlling the horde. The alley was narrow and dark, but it provided the cover she needed as she crept toward the street. As she got closer, the sound of the zombies grew louder, but it wasn't just their footsteps she could hear. It was the rhythm of their movements, like a twisted dance that seemed to follow the commands of the figure in the street. The closer she got, the more she could feel the oppressive weight of whatever power was at work. The figure was standing completely still now, its head raised, and its eyes gleaming with an eerie, supernatural glow. It wasn't human. Iris stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The figure's features slowly became clearer in the dim light, and what she saw made her blood run cold. It was wearing a mask, a grotesque, half-human, half-dead face, its skin rotting away, as if it had been carved from the very flesh of a zombie. But the eyes, they were the eyes of someone still alive. They burned with intelligence, with malice. The figure raised its hands slowly, and the zombies responded. Their movements grew more precise, synchronized. Iris watched in awe and horror as the creatures twisted and turned, their heads snapping in unnatural directions, as though they were puppets on strings. She felt a chill crawl up her spine as she realized the truth. The zombies weren't just being controlled, they were being commanded by something more powerful. This was no random mutation, no virus gone haywire. This was deliberate. Behind her, she could hear Callum's voice faintly calling her name, but she ignored it. She had to stay focused. This thing was the key. And it was somehow tethered to the horde in ways she couldn't comprehend. The figure turned its head sharply in her direction, its eyes locking onto hers with terrifying precision. For a moment, Iris froze, caught in the intensity of the gaze. It wasn't just a zombie, it wasn't even human. It was something otherworldly, something that had transcended death itself. Then, as if responding to her presence, the figure's mouth twisted into a twisted smile, the edges of its lips stretching unnaturally wide. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The moment it smiled, the zombies around it surged forward, moving faster than ever before, their rotting limbs flailing as they broke into a run toward her position. Fear surged through Iris's veins. She turned to retreat but found herself face to face with an even larger group of zombies that had appeared behind her. The horde was closing in from all sides, cutting off any chance of escape. Callum's voice grew louder now. "Iris. Get back here. We need to go, now." But the distance between them was too great. Iris didn't have time to reach him. The figure, the thing in the center of the chaos, was controlling them. And as the undead surged toward her, she realized that the real threat wasn't just the zombies. It was the force that had twisted them into something far worse. The world was falling apart in ways she had never imagined, and Iris understood now that the true enemy was not just the dead, but whatever was commanding them from the shadows. Iris was trapped. The horde had closed in too quickly. The deafening sound of their growls and the scraping of their twisted limbs filled the air, drowning out everything else. She could barely breathe, let alone think straight as the grotesque figures surrounding her staggered toward her with an unnatural force. The figure that controlled them, the one that had been standing in the middle of the street, orchestrating the chaos, had unleashed the full power of the undead, and now, it seemed, there was no escape. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pressed herself into the narrow corner of the alley, her back against the crumbling brick wall. The zombies were moving faster now, their motions more precise, like they were following an unspoken command. It was as if they were no longer aimlessly searching for flesh, they were hunting, tracking, and closing in on her with purpose. Iris glanced around, trying to find any possible way out, but there was nothing, just a sea of undead bodies, their faces twisted into horrific masks of hunger and rage. The alley was her prison, and the streets beyond her were no safer. She needed to find a way to break free before the zombies overwhelmed her completely. Callum's voice called out to her again, "Iris. I'm coming. Stay where you are." It was a desperate cry, but Iris knew there was no way Callum could reach her in time. The zombies were already upon her. She could see their broken bodies lurching toward her from all sides, their decayed fingers reaching for her, their empty eyes locked onto her with a cold, merciless hunger. And then, as if everything slowed down, the figure in the street moved again. It was like a puppet master pulling the strings, a figure so dark and powerful that it felt like the very earth beneath Iris's feet was trembling. The figure turned its head toward her, its glowing eyes locking onto hers once again, as though it knew she was the one it wanted. The zombies around her paused for just a moment, as though waiting for further instructions. In that brief moment of stillness, Iris could feel the weight of something malevolent pressing down on her, something ancient and dangerous that was controlling the undead, bending them to its will. It was as if the very essence of life and death had become a mere game, a twisted play, and Iris was caught in its grip. Her pulse raced. The longer she stayed in this spot, the closer the zombies came. But she wasn't ready to give up. She had to fight. She had to survive. The only question now was how. The figure moved again, its hands raised high, as though commanding the horde to advance. And that's when Iris saw it. The twisted, grotesque glow in the figure's eyes was not just a sign of some sick power over the undead. It was something darker, something older. Suddenly, a realization hit Iris with the force of a thunderclap. This wasn't just a being controlling zombies, it was more than that. It was something that had learned how to harness the very essence of life and death, using the undead as vessels for its will. The figure wasn't just controlling the zombies, it was somehow feeding off of them. This being had become something far beyond human, beyond zombie. It was something that existed outside the normal laws of nature. It had learned to transcend death itself. But how? A desperate plan formed in Iris's mind. If the figure could control the zombies, then perhaps there was a way to disrupt its power, something, anything that could sever the connection between the undead and their master. But she would need to get closer. She would need to face the figure head-on. And it would be dangerous. As the zombies neared, Iris took a deep breath, steeling herself for the fight of her life. She grabbed a rusted pipe from the ground, clutching it tightly in her hands as a weapon. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. With the horde now closing in around her, Iris lunged toward the front, pushing through the zombies with all her might. She swung the pipe, knocking one zombie away before another grabbed hold of her. Her breath hitched as the rotting flesh of the creature pressed against her. With a scream, Iris twisted the pipe and shoved it into the zombie's skull, sending it collapsing to the ground. But she couldn't stop. Not now. Pushing forward, Iris continued her desperate charge, her body aching, her heart pounding in her ears. She had to get to that figure, she had to understand what was controlling all of this. The figure turned again, its twisted smile growing wider as Iris drew closer. It raised one hand, and the horde responded. But this time, the undead didn't move toward her, they moved toward the figure itself, gathering around it like a protective shield. Iris stopped short, realizing with horror that she had miscalculated. The figure wasn't just commanding them, it was drawing them into its orbit, using them as a barrier to keep anyone from reaching it. She needed another plan. But before she could think further, something shifted in the air. The ground beneath her feet trembled once more. This wasn't the horde moving, it was something else, something far more powerful. Iris turned to see the massive building behind her starting to collapse, the old concrete structure cracking under the weight of the undead and the force of whatever dark power was at work. The figure in the distance raised its arms again, but this time, something was different. The zombies didn't just follow the command, they evolved. The creatures around Iris began to mutate before her eyes, their limbs twisting into grotesque new shapes, their eyes widening as they adapted, evolving into something even more dangerous. It was as though the figure was not just controlling the horde, it was reshaping it. The virus, the mutation, it was evolving at an unimaginable speed. And that was when Iris realized the horrifying truth: the zombies weren't the true threat anymore. The real danger was the entity controlling them. It was creating a new breed of undead, one that could think, adapt, and destroy. It was not just the end of civilization, it was the dawn of something even more monstrous. As Iris struggled to breathe, the ground beneath her feet crumbled, and the world seemed to spiral into chaos. There was no escape. There was only one way forward. To face the master of the horde, and end it before it could end them all. Iris's world was unraveling before her eyes. The ground trembled beneath her feet, a violent quake that shook loose debris from the crumbling buildings around her. The mutated zombies surged forward with terrifying speed, their limbs snapping into new, twisted shapes, their rotting faces contorting into grotesque masks of hunger and rage. But they weren't just mindless killers anymore. These were evolving creatures, smarter, faster, more dangerous than anything she had ever seen. It was as though the very essence of death had become an art form, sculpted and shaped by the dark power controlling them. And at the heart of this madness stood the figure, towering above the chaos, its dark, glowing eyes still fixed on her. The figure didn't need to move to control the horde, it merely willed them, and they obeyed. The zombies now moved with a new precision, as if their once mindless hunger had been replaced by something far more insidious, an agenda. Iris felt the weight of the situation settle over her. She wasn't just fighting for her survival anymore. She was fighting against something that had transcended death itself, something that had learned how to manipulate the very fabric of life and death. The figure in the street was no longer just a threat, it was a force, an entity beyond understanding, and it had changed the rules of the game entirely. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stumbled back, trying to make sense of what was happening. Callum was still somewhere out there, but she couldn't think about him now. She had to focus on the task at hand. She needed to find a way to stop the figure, to break its control over the zombies before they completely overtook her and the rest of the survivors. But how? Her eyes scanned the area, desperate for something, anything, that could turn the tide in her favor. The horde was moving in on her from every direction, their movements faster and more organized than before. Iris gripped the rusted pipe tightly, knowing it wouldn't be enough to hold them off for long. The streets were littered with the remains of buildings, cars, and debris, but it was all useless. There was no real cover, no place to hide. And then, she saw it. A glimmer of light reflected off something metallic in the distance. It was faint, but it was enough to catch her attention. The figure controlling the horde was still standing there, unblinking, its focus locked on her. But it didn't seem to notice the object in the distance, a large, rusted tanker truck parked up ahead, half sunk into the ground as if it had been abandoned in the chaos of the early days of the outbreak. Iris's mind raced. If she could get to that truck, maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to use it to her advantage. The tanker might be empty, but it could still provide some kind of diversion. If she could cause an explosion, or even just block the street, it might give her a chance to slip past the zombies and get to the figure before it evolved any further. But getting there wouldn't be easy. The mutated zombies were closing in, their glowing eyes tracking her every move. She could already hear their growls growing louder, the sound of their footsteps thundering toward her like an approaching storm. Without thinking, Iris bolted toward the tanker truck, her legs pumping with all the strength she had left. She didn't know how much time she had, but she knew she couldn't waste another second. The zombies were getting smarter, faster, and she had to move before they realized what she was planning. But as she ran, she felt the weight of their presence, the oppressive pull of their collective hunger drawing closer. The smell of decay filled her nostrils as she passed them, and she could almost hear the sinister hum of their twisted thoughts. They weren't just zombies, they were becoming something else, something more dangerous, and she had to stop them before it was too late. The tanker truck loomed closer, and Iris's heart hammered in her chest. She was almost there. But then, without warning, the ground beneath her feet gave way. Iris cried out as she stumbled, her foot slipping into a hole in the pavement. She tried to regain her balance, but it was too late. The world tilted, and she crashed to the ground with a sickening thud, her head spinning from the impact. For a moment, everything went black. When she regained consciousness, she was still lying on the ground, but the sound of the horde's approach had grown louder. The mutated zombies were almost upon her, and she could feel their cold breath on her skin. The figure in the distance was still watching, unmoving, as though it was content to let the horde finish what it had started. Iris's vision blurred, and her body ached all over. She couldn't afford to lose focus. She had to get up, had to keep moving. With a strained gasp, she pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaking with the effort. She could hear the growls of the zombies behind her, their heavy footsteps echoing through the streets. The figure was still there, its eyes glowing brightly, waiting for her next move. But Iris wasn't done yet. She wouldn't give up. She stumbled toward the tanker, her hands outstretched, reaching for anything that might help her. The truck's rusted exterior was cold and slick, but it was her only hope now. She glanced back at the horde, now just a few feet away. Their grotesque, mutated forms were more horrifying than ever, their bodies contorted into unnatural angles as they lurched forward. But the figure was still standing there, watching, unblinking. It wasn't just controlling them, it was feeding on their death, on their destruction. Iris couldn't let that happen. She had to stop it, no matter the cost. With a final, desperate push, she reached the tanker truck. Her fingers found a lever on the side, and with all her remaining strength, she yanked it. The sound of metal grinding against metal filled the air, and the truck's massive engine roared to life. The tanker began to move, slowly at first, but then faster as the engine sputtered and surged forward. The undead horde, sensing the shift, began to close in on her. But Iris had no choice. She slammed the accelerator pedal with all the force she had left, and the truck lurched forward, heading straight for the heart of the figure's twisted control. As the truck surged toward its target, Iris knew there was no turning back. The figure had underestimated her. Now, she was going to make sure it paid the price for it. The engine of the tanker roared like a wild beast as it surged toward the figure in the distance. Iris's hands gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white with the strain. She could feel her pulse racing in her ears, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but she didn't dare let up. The truck was her last hope. She couldn't afford to fail now. Behind her, the horde of mutated zombies continued their relentless advance, their twisted forms closing in on her like a tidal wave of death. Their grotesque, deformed limbs flailed with unnatural speed, and their hungry growls reverberated through the streets. But Iris didn't look back. She couldn't afford to focus on them. The figure, standing unmoving at the center of it all, was the true threat. It was the one pulling the strings, controlling the very essence of the apocalypse. If she could reach it, if she could destroy it, then maybe, just maybe, the nightmare would end. The truck's massive tires screeched as it careened down the street, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. Iris had no plan, no idea if this was going to work, but she had no choice but to keep pushing forward. The figure ahead of her didn't even flinch, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intensity as it watched her approach. The truck was getting closer, and Iris's grip tightened around the wheel. She could feel the vibrations in her body as the vehicle barreled down the cracked and broken road, the roar of the engine deafening in her ears. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. The horde was gaining on her, their growls growing louder, more desperate. But she could see the figure's form becoming clearer, could see its twisted face watching her with cold indifference. Her mind raced, frantically calculating the best way to end this nightmare. She couldn't hit the figure directly with the truck, it was too fast, too far ahead. But there was something else. The truck wasn't just a weapon. It was a tool. And if she could use it correctly, it could give her the opening she needed. With a swift turn of the wheel, Iris veered the truck to the side, narrowly avoiding a pile of debris. The tanker skidded, its tires screeching against the cracked pavement. The undead were closing in from all directions now, their grotesque forms moving with unnatural speed, but Iris couldn't slow down. She had to get closer. She had to get the figure's attention. The sound of the truck's horn blasted through the air, sharp and urgent. Iris slammed her foot onto the gas pedal, sending the truck barreling toward the figure. She could feel the weight of her actions, the crushing realization that this could be her last moment. But she couldn't stop now. She had to end this. She had to take a stand. The figure didn't react, its glowing eyes still fixed on her as she hurtled toward it. Then, just as she was about to collide with the figure, something strange happened. the air around her seemed to shift, as if the very atmosphere had grown heavier. The ground beneath her feet vibrated with an unnatural power. Iris's eyes widened in shock as she realized what was happening. The figure wasn't just controlling the zombies, it was controlling everything. The ground cracked open in front of her, and a wave of energy rippled outward, sending a shockwave through the street. The truck jolted violently, throwing Iris against the wheel. She barely managed to keep control as the truck veered off course, skidding dangerously to the side. And then, the figure moved. It was like a blur of darkness, faster than anything Iris had ever seen. In a single, fluid motion, the figure reached out and grasped the truck by the front, halting its momentum as if it were nothing more than a toy. The truck groaned under the immense pressure, the metal creaking and straining as the figure lifted it effortlessly into the air. Iris's breath caught in her throat as she struggled to keep her grip on the wheel. The figure's eyes burned into hers, and she could feel the weight of its gaze like 1,000 tons pressing down on her chest. It was as though the figure was judging her, toying with her, deciding just how she would meet her end. "You think you can stop me?" the figure's voice echoed, its tone cold and ancient. "You are nothing but a small, fragile insect in a world that is already mine." Iris's mind raced. She had no time to argue with it. There was no way to defeat it head-on, not like this. But there was something she could do. Something that might give her the opening she needed. With every ounce of strength she had left, Iris threw herself out of the truck, rolling to the side just as the figure's dark power lifted the vehicle higher. The ground shook beneath her as she hit the pavement, her body sore from the impact, but she pushed through the pain. The figure was distracted, its attention was on the truck, not on her. Iris scrambled to her feet, her legs weak, her body screaming in protest. The mutated zombies were closing in, their twisted faces inches from her. But she didn't hesitate. She sprinted forward, using the debris around her as cover. She couldn't let herself get caught. Not now. She had to make it to the figure before it destroyed everything. The horde was almost upon her, but Iris kept her eyes locked on her target, the figure, still holding the truck in the air, its dark power pulsing with terrifying intensity. It was too focused on its victory to notice her moving closer, inch by inch. Iris reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against the cold, metallic object she had found earlier, the flare gun. She had no idea if it would work, if it would even do anything, but it was the only option left. She raised it high, aiming for the figure, and fired. The flare shot into the air with a loud hiss, streaking toward the figure's form. The moment it hit, a burst of light exploded in the air, momentarily blinding Iris. And in that brief flash, the figure's form wavered, like a mirage, flickering in and out of existence. That was it. The figure screamed, a sound that reverberated through the air like a banshee's wail, as its grip on the truck faltered. The force that had held it in place weakened, and the truck, now freed from its grasp, plummeted to the ground with a deafening crash. Iris didn't wait for a second chance. She dove toward the truck, using the distraction to her advantage. As the figure reeled from the flare's impact, she climbed into the truck, her heart racing, her hands shaking. This was her only chance. She started the engine, and with a roar, the truck surged forward, heading straight for the figure. It was time to finish what she had started. Part 7, The Final Reckoning. The truck roared forward, a last-ditch effort to break the figure's control over the world that was now a twisted nightmare. Iris's hands gripped the wheel so tightly her knuckles bled white, her heart pounding in her chest like a drumbeat. The truck's engine screamed as it charged at the figure, a force of nature, and Iris knew this was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she could either end this apocalypse or be consumed by it. The figure, a dark silhouette against the decaying skyline, didn't move. Its eyes glowed brighter than ever before, locking onto Iris with an intensity that could melt steel. The air around it shimmered with an unnatural power, and Iris could feel the cold rush of death that emanated from its very presence. It wasn't just a creature anymore, it was a harbinger of doom, a force that had turned everything around her into a nightmare. The mutated zombies, no longer just mindless killers but soldiers under the figure's control, seemed to hesitate as the truck barreled toward them. They faltered, confused by the flare gun's unexpected attack, giving Iris a fleeting chance. The zombie horde, however, was still closing in from all sides, their disfigured bodies writhing and groaning with hunger. There was no time for second chances, only a single, desperate effort to destroy the source of their torment. The truck lurched over a pile of rubble, sending Iris's body slamming against the seat. Her vision blurred as the air shook with the approaching blast of the horde. She steadied herself, barely managing to keep control. Her eyes were fixed on the figure ahead. Its eyes never left her. The figure's voice echoed in her mind, cold and taunting, a whisper of doom. Asterisk, you cannot win. You cannot fight what is already inevitable. The end is here, and there is nothing you can do. Asterisk. Iris's grip on the wheel tightened even further. No, she thought. I refuse to accept that. As the truck neared the figure, Iris could see its form shifting and warping. The air around it crackled with power, distorting reality itself. It was almost as though the figure existed outside the bounds of the physical world, an entity that didn't belong in this time or place. The undead horde, now surrounding her, seemed to grow agitated, sensing the impending climax of their twisted leader's wrath. Iris could feel the pressure building in the air, the weight of the world's fate hanging by the thinnest thread. With every ounce of energy, she swerved the truck, aiming straight for the center of the figure's power. As she closed the gap, something strange began to happen. The world around her seemed to slow, the air thickening like syrup. Time itself felt warped, and she was caught in a vortex of terror and confusion. The truck groaned beneath her, shaking with a violent force that threatened to tear it apart. Her heart pounded harder, her breath a ragged mess in her chest. Asterisk, I won't stop. I can't stop, asterisk. Suddenly, the truck's front tires hit something solid. The entire vehicle lurched violently, jerking Iris forward. She slammed into the steering wheel, a sharp pain shooting through her body. The air seemed to crack, like a whip breaking through the tension, and then... boom! An explosion of light filled her vision as the truck collided with the figure's invisible barrier. The impact sent a shockwave through the streets, and Iris felt herself being thrown back into the seat, her head pounding. The truck screeched, its frame buckling under the strain. The figure's form flickered and distorted, an ethereal presence fighting against the force that was trying to tear it apart. Iris could see it now, the figure wasn't just one being. It was a manifestation of the apocalypse itself, a reflection of the destruction that had befallen the world. And as the truck's explosion tore through the barrier, Iris saw the figure's true nature, a dark, shifting mass of shadows and rotting flesh, something born from pure malice. The horde roared, charging forward, but there was something different in their movements now. They weren't as synchronized. Their steps faltered, their eyes losing their glow as the power that had once controlled them began to flicker. The air around them buzzed with static, like a fading signal, as if the very essence of their existence was being undone. Iris's eyes widened in realization. The flare had been a catalyst, a spark that had disrupted the figure's connection to the horde. The truck, the impact, it had shattered the hold the figure had on the world. And now, the zombies were beginning to turn on each other, disorganized, no longer unified by the dark force. The figure screamed, its voice an otherworldly shriek that rattled her bones. The shadows around it wriggled and shifted violently, but the figure itself was losing its power. The horde's movements became erratic as the control weakened. Iris knew it wasn't over yet. This was only the beginning of the final battle. With everything she had left, she reached into the glove compartment and pulled out the last weapon she had, a flare. It was her last hope, the last weapon to finish what had started. She climbed out of the truck, her legs shaky, and aimed the flare gun straight at the figure. With trembling hands, she fired. The flare shot through the air, trailing behind it a streak of bright orange light. As it neared the figure, the shadows around it hissed and recoiled, unable to keep up with the flare's sudden burst of energy. The moment the flare hit the figure, there was a blinding flash, followed by a deafening crack that shook the ground beneath her. Iris covered her eyes against the light, but she could feel it, the figure's presence disintegrating, its form collapsing into a swirling mass of dark energy. The horde, now completely thrown into chaos, scattered in all directions, their unified purpose shattered. The figure's body crumbled, breaking into fragments of shadow and decaying flesh, until all that was left was a whisper on the wind. And with that final, haunting cry, the control over the zombies was broken. The world, for the first time in months, was silent. Iris stood alone in the wreckage of the streets, breathing heavily, the flare gun still smoking in her hand. The truck was destroyed, but the figure was gone. The zombies, those that weren't already disintegrating or turning on each other, stumbled aimlessly, lost and confused, without purpose. And in the stillness, Iris realized that she had done it. She had ended it. The battle was over, and the apocalypse was finally, irrevocably, finished. The world around Iris was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of a collapsing building or the soft shuffle of the disoriented zombies, no longer driven by the dark power that once controlled them. She stood amidst the ruins, her body aching from the physical and emotional toll of the battle. The flare gun that had been her final weapon was still heavy in her hand, though she no longer felt the urgency of the fight. The skies above were a pale gray, the sun barely piercing through the clouds of dust and smoke that had settled over the city like a shroud. It was over. The figure, the source of all the chaos, was gone. The zombies, those that hadn't already collapsed into nothing, were scattered, their once unyielding hunger now aimless and lost. For the first time since the apocalypse had begun, there was a flicker of hope. But that hope came with a heavy cost. The city, once teeming with life, now stood as a hollow shell, its streets empty except for the occasional groan or whisper of wind through the broken windows. The world Iris had known, the world before the nightmare began, seemed like a distant memory, something almost too far gone to grasp. There were no more humans left, not that she could see, and the world she was left with felt like a fractured reflection of what it once was. Iris walked slowly through the streets, her steps echoing in the silence. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of rot and burnt remnants of what used to be homes and businesses. A few stray zombies shuffled aimlessly past her, oblivious to her presence, their minds no longer clouded by the figure's influence. She could see them for what they were now, people who had lost their way, twisted by the infection, now just shadows of their former selves. She had made it. She had survived. But now, as she looked around at the desolation, she couldn't help but wonder what came next. What do I do now? She asked herself, the weight of the question pressing down on her shoulders. There were no answers. No one to share the burden with. It was just her, the last survivor in a world that had been ravaged by death and darkness. She had fought so hard to get to this point, to end the nightmare that had taken everything from her. But now that it was over, the emptiness was almost more suffocating than the terror she had lived through. Her eyes landed on a broken storefront nearby, a faded sign hanging above the door that once read "Welcome to the Future." The irony of it struck her, a future that was no longer certain, a future she hadn't expected to see, much less to carry on alone. Taking a deep breath, Iris stepped into the building, the door creaking under her weight. Inside, it was a ghost of what it had once been, rows of empty shelves, abandoned merchandise, and the faintest trace of what had been left behind in haste. She didn't know why she came here, perhaps it was the faint hope of finding something useful or perhaps the need to feel connected to the world that had been. She moved deeper into the store, her footsteps soft against the dust-covered floor. Her eyes scanned the aisles, landing on a small section of books. It was a strange sight, books, in a place like this, in a world that no longer seemed to care for such things. But something about them pulled her in, and she walked over to the shelf, her fingers brushing the worn spines. The titles were old, some in languages she no longer recognized, but they represented something she needed, a connection to the past, to the life she had lived before everything changed. Iris picked up a book, its cover torn but still intact. She opened it to a random page and began to read, her voice barely a whisper in the vast emptiness. The words on the page were strange, but they felt grounding, a reminder of a world that had once thrived. The story was simple, about a small town that overcame adversity and found hope again. It was a story of survival, of rebuilding, of a world that didn't give up. As she read, she felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was naive, but the story reminded her of something she needed to hold on to, the belief that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, there was always a chance for renewal, for rebuilding. She closed the book, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Iris allowed herself to sit down, the weight of exhaustion finally settling in. She wasn't sure what came next. She didn't know if there was anyone else out there, if there were more survivors, or if the world would ever return to what it had once been. But in that moment, in the quiet of the ruined world, Iris made a decision. She would continue. She would rebuild, even if it was just for herself. There was no going back, but there was still a future to be shaped, a world to be forged from the ashes of the past. The sun, now breaking through the clouds, cast a soft light through the cracked windows, and Iris looked out at the empty streets with a new resolve. She had fought the darkness and survived. Now, it was time to take the first steps into a new world, one she would create, one she would make her own. And with that, she stood up, her back straight, her heart stronger than it had ever been. The world was broken, but it was still hers to change. The apocalypse had come, and the apocalypse had gone. Now, it was time for something new. A world reborn. She stepped out into the streets, leaving the store behind, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The journey ahead would be long and uncertain, but Iris knew one thing for sure. She would be ready.